Hello, everybody. I'm Jeff Wilkinson, and welcome to our very first episode of All Things Quality. I'm a podcast that talks about quality and disruptive technology and anything in between. I'm Jeff Wilkinson. As I said, I recently retired from 30 years at Accenture, where I was the global lead for the Accenture testing practice, which we call Accenture Quality Engineering Services. I also led the Accenture office in Indianapolis. And with me today is my very fine friend, CEO of Digy4, Parasar Saha. And Parasar, you want to say anything before we get started?
So I want to mention that, I'm really honored to be in this podcast, with you, I think we couldn't have a better guest than Conroy to start with. I'm looking forward to this podcast.
Conroy is the Director of Development for Digital Applications at Air Canada. As a consumer of Air Canada, many times I have used his product and love it. I can also say that our focus today is going to be on artificial intelligence, generative AI and other types of AI, and the quality aspects that surround that. And Conroy is a leader in the industry focusing on that with Air Canada. So Conroy, what else can you tell us about yourself?
Thanks for that, Jeff, and thanks, Parasar, for that intro as well. I have over 30 years, I would say, in quality assurance. And recently I've taken over the role, a couple of years now, the role of development lead at Air Canada for the digital application. So I do inform a lot of what I do from a digital development perspective with a quality background that I had. And I do also want to say, Parasar worked with me in the past, and one of the things that we really, focused on is how we can, move quality from being sort of a gatekeeper function to an enabler function. And I think that is one of the key things that, I think, as quality professionals, we want to bring into that role. How do we use the quality function, the quality organization, the quality team to get the requirements, get the needs of the business out the door as quickly as possible? And that is something that I certainly do call upon in my role as a development lead at Air Canada.
Yeah, the fact that you are using AI in sort of this manner, it's a foresight of what we're seeing in the industry right now and the quality aspects that are around that. You're going to be sort of a guinea pig, a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. But let's start simple here and talk about what is it exactly that you're using AI for. I know revenue management and predictability and that sort of thing. Can you give us an idea of why you're using AI and how you're using it? And then we can go into some of the quality aspects after that.
Yeah, so prior to the generative AI explosion, let's call it that, certainly companies like Air Canada spent quite a bit of time developing AI technologies. One way of thinking about it is, a company like an airline, we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data in terms of passengers, routes, fares, what works, what does not work. And then you need to look at parsing that data and coming up with solutions for the customers that work. When you think of the way a traditional airline works, prior to the pandemic, we really had two major planning seasons. We had the winter season where we planned for the summer, and then we had the summer season where we planned for the winter. And as the pandemic has disrupted that entire flow, now you need to look at more of a continuous planning aspect. And these are some of the areas where AI certainly helps with our planning in terms of our fleet, in terms of our prices, in terms of our destination. When you look at how an airline operates, you're balancing things like fuel, which is a very expensive cost. You're balancing the different routes that you fly through. It might be a cost to fly over Canada versus a different cost to fly over the US, but it might be a longer route through the US. So you have to balance all these different variables, and AI is very well suited for that type of activity.
Well, you mentioned data, and data requires large language modeling and all kinds of things with huge data lakes required, and data ingestion and making sure the data you have is correct. How do you ensure the data that you're ingesting for your AI models is working correctly?
Yeah, and that's a great point. So, one of the things that we did at Air Canada, we're still in the massive journey of re-architecting our entire data infrastructure. So that involves, as you mentioned, migrating data from systems, moving into more of a data lake type architecture, separating operational data from data that you use for analyzing situations. So there's a whole bunch of aspects to that whole data management pipeline that goes into making sure you have the right data, you have accurate data, and the quality of the data is good enough so that you're getting valuable insights out of the AI models.
Is there anything that you do to ensure that the data that you're ingesting is not biased in some way?
So in terms of the data being biased in some way, for our scenarios or our use cases, there's less of that that impact, let's say, because the data that we're looking at is mostly around our passengers and the journeys and the cost of fuel or the weather and that sort of stuff. So for us, it's less of an issue than some other businesses that might be more reliant on external data that's out there that might be biased. Or data, I would say, is a lot more targeted to the type of activities that we do. That said, we have an entire organization that's sort of dedicated to managing, maintaining, architecting, and solving the data challenges that we have. And those organizations sort of feed into their sort of inputs into the type of work that I do to make sure that that data is used to present an experience for our customers or an experience for our employees to make that journey as effective as possible for the customer. So
Okay.
I'm more on the application side of things, and I ingest that data from the teams that maintain that.
Got it. Okay, good. Well, so for the quality engineers that are on this podcast, give us an idea of how you go about testing the content that you created through the AI process.
Yeah, so that is a challenge. So I remember when we just started looking at the AI team. So I started at Air Canada 5 years ago, and around the same time we started seriously investing in AI. And I certainly had quite a few conversations with various of our support teams, such as Accenture and Hexaware and a few others, to say, how do you actually test for AI, right? When you start testing the AI models, for example, it almost as if that test, those experiences that you have from testing become part of the data that the system is learning from as well. So testing AI, as you said, is certainly a challenging aspect. And the key aspects that we focused on when we were looking at it was clearly around the requirements, clear around the end expectations of the systems or the customers. And that's sort of the aspect that we focus on. Are we getting the expectations that our business stakeholders or end customers are expecting? So that's sort of the lens that we use to look at the type of testing that we did.
Okay. Well, interestingly, yesterday, your code share partner in the US, United, you may know where I'm going with this, right? Had a major outage. And the outage was because they proliferated software across the network, and it was apparently not tested well enough because it slowed everything down. And they had to delay flights, they had to cancel some flights, and they had to redo that proliferation of software. Is there something that you and your organization would have done differently to avoid that kind of what was really a bad day for United Airlines?
Yeah, so what I can say is I can't speak to the United specific scenario because I don't know the details of what created that issue. So one of the things I strongly believe in a quality organization is postmortems or retrospectives, right? So you're going to experience many different types of issues or failures. And I think having a robust sort of postmortem exercise or retro exercise to understand what those failures are, there's really two aspects to it. There's a short-term immediate fix that you need to do. And then there's a longer-term strategy about what actually caused that failure to happen in the first place. And then based on that, you can start adjusting your practice to make sure you cover those. So those are some generalities. Again, being unable to speak to specifically what happened at United. I can say that in an environment as complex as what we have in the airlines, you do experience issues in production that are relatively, difficult to capture in your internal test environments. So the concept of shifting right to be able to test in production, to be able to test various different loads, to be able to test various different scenarios, I think has been one of the challenges that I've seen in this industry. And some of these failures that you see, generally speaking, in a production type environment, for the airlines, are generally related to various and production type scenarios that are sometimes difficult to recreate in a test environment.
Parasar, I see you had your hand raised. Do you want to interject here?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of key things that you mentioned, right? And first of all, I like the fact that you are in dev, but you still have that QA hat on you. I can see that passion still. So one of the things that you kind of highlighted is the data piece, right? So there's a business data and there is this software data, the life cycle data, right? How do you see that? How do you see your organization retaining that data and contributing to a predictability of your life cycle of the software?
Yeah, if I understand what you're talking about, I think there's a couple of points, right? So in terms of the operational data, so this is data about how many users are using the system at a certain point in time. Maybe you have a seat sale happening. Maybe there's many customers logging in trying to purchase something. Maybe you have a backend environment that is not static but designed to scale. So there's a number of different levers that you might need to adjust in order to ensure that the system is not failing when you get an excess of users on it. So I'm not sure that in this case it's a question of not having enough data to test with. I think it may be a case of creating the right loading parameters, right? The right stressing parameters. In these type of production test scenarios, you might have edge cases that you encountered internally that might seem, to be like a low priority scenario, but that edge case becomes a massive failure, depending on what your load looks like. So to your point, your operational data that you have in the system will help you identify the different scenarios and the way to test those different scenarios. But often the failures that you see in production, I would imagine, are related to the different aspect of the system that's actually being stressed.
I agree with Parasar. It's if every development lead had spent time in testing, we'd see a whole lot fewer quality problems than we do today. So it's good that you have that perspective. Parasar, any other questions or any follow-ups on that?
No, I think I get your perspective. Thanks, Conroy, for you.
So I want to kind of switch a little bit to we know that there are tremendous benefits from AI. With any disruptive technology, the reason why it's disruptive is because it's beneficial. It creates something really good, like the internet back in 1991 created something that was just completely disrupted technology and disrupted communications. But there's potential for badness, right? People use the internet for crime and for all kinds of malfeasance. Do you anticipate or do you see anything from your usage of AI that could be a negative for Air Canada or for the technology industry in general? Conroy, anything you've seen?
Yeah, so I think we can take a look at the large language model AI systems that are prevalent right now and taking the world a little bit by storm. And one of the things about these systems is just with any AI system really is the data that you train the system with. I looked at Bing, the Bing chat when it came out initially. That's based on the open AI system or models. And when it was initially launched, there were several problems with that tool. But the key difference between that tool at the time and what was happening with ChatGPT was that tool was using fresh data from the internet. And basically what users were encountering was a system that was learning all the positives and negatives that are actually on the internet right now and basically replaying it back. So in a way, it's really a reflection, or was a reflection, of what was happening on the internet, a reflection of the experiences that we as users are experiencing on the internet, all the good and all the bad. So again, the AI system is only as good as the data that you fed it. Now, once you start curating that data, then the system starts changing. And as the system starts changing, then you sort of limit some of the capabilities of the system and limit some of the ability of the system to reflect, the way society is, or to behave like an actual human. But at the same time, by restricting it to a certain extent, you make it a lot safer for different individuals to access. So to answer your question directly, there's a lot of harm or that an AI system can create, both in the perpetration, or the continuation of certain negatives that are in society. There's harm in that sense, and there's also harm in the sense that as people come to rely on these systems, they tend to overlook, for lack of a better way of saying, the negatives that's inherent in some of these type of applications.
So, Conroy, with ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence elements that exist out there, we see tremendous usage of it, right? It can take some of the mundane out of the people's hands and allow them to do what they need to do, and then they can just review it and then make sure that it's correct. But some people use ChatGPT for bad things, right? They use it to create deepfakes, or they use it to write their term paper and pass it off to their professor as their own work. Is there anything, and by the way, anytime you have a disruptive technology, it creates a lag in regulations in terms of policing that technology. The internet's a good example. It took years and years before the regulations caught up globally with what we had with the internet. For artificial intelligence, do you see anything in Parliament in Canada? I should mention you guys are both in Toronto. I'm in Indianapolis in the US Congress, the European Union. Anything you see in regulation bodies that are focused on regulating artificial intelligence to make sure that it can't be used for bad things?
Yeah, so first, I have to state that I'm not an expert on the legal aspect of things, but what I can say is that certainly, as with most new technologies, regulations tend to be a bit behind. However, and there's a lot of buzz, a lot of conversations about, what will government do, and government is getting involved and working on different types of means of mitigating some of these things. But the expectation generally is that it will be behind. However, in my industry, in the aviation industry, we're federally regulated. And we certainly have to make sure that whatever technologies that we roll out meet certain conditions, right? And even if you think of, we are governed under the European regulations as well, as far as data and data privacy are concerned. So even though there's no specific regulation around AI at this point in time, it's incumbent on us to ensure that we're, guarding the data, guarding the usability, guarding the experience of our customers, and as well as our employees as well, given that this is such a disruptive technology. But in terms of any sort of regulation that's on the horizon, I'm not privy to anything that's anywhere near to being implemented.
There's a lot we don't know, right? And
Yeah.
It's interesting to see 10 years from now, maybe 2 years from now, where we stand in terms of regulation, in terms of continued evolution of AI. One thing that I'm seeing in the press around usage of AI is the potential to eliminate jobs, right? That AI, you saw this back when I was growing up. You saw, automation and robots, it's going to take people's jobs. And of course, it actually created more jobs and stuff like that. Do you see any relevance to AI taking people's jobs?
That's a great question, right? So, just looking at the impact, we have started, rolling out, co-pilot technologies or ML, large language models in our development teams. Right now, we're focusing on co-pilot, right? From GitHub. However, and we're also looking at technologies from Amazon, and we're looking at technologies with Microsoft as well. we have enabled a couple of teams, a couple of pods within our team to use this technology, and we're already seeing greater than 2x improvement in velocity, right? We're also seeing improvement in quality to the points of something like 67% less defects, right, in a given sprint. So there's a couple of ways to interpret that. When we initially started talking about having the teams use this technology, there are certain developers that were really excited to get started on it. But at the same time, there are other developers that were a bit concerned about two factors. Factor number one is, what does that do to our jobs? And factor number two is, what does that do to our skill set? Does that sort of dumb down our skill sets if we're starting to rely on this technology more and more? Now, in terms of the aspect of what does it do to our jobs, fortunately, in our case, we have a huge backlog of work that we have to get done. And from year to year, it's more that we're delaying activities that we want to get at. So from our perspective, we're saying, hey, we're able to do a lot of those things that are sitting on the backlog that will benefit the business that we had to push off. So from our perspective right now, we're seeing the ability to get things done. We're not looking or seeing an impact in terms of the number of people at this point in time. In terms of the second aspect, which is around, hey, we're starting to dumb down our skill set, what we're finding is that the tool is literally working as I mentioned, as a co-pilot. It's literally working as an assistant, basically sitting on your lap that you're working with to get things done. That is the experience, that is the feedback that we're getting right now. So we're very careful in how we roll this out, in the sense that, one, we're actually measuring the velocity, we're actually measuring the quality, but we're constantly measuring the user sentiment in terms of how is this tool actually making your day-to-day life. One of the big things that developers have mentioned is that it actually enhances flow, right? So as a developer, you want to be in that zone, and the sense is that the tool is actually enhancing and enabling the developer to remain in that flow zone longer. And the other thing that we're seeing is it's sort of leveling the playing field a little bit, where junior developers can start feeling or producing a little bit more higher quality work faster. And we still have senior developers that are saying, you know what, I'm still faster than this tool, I'm still better than this tool, it's really not adding any value to my productivity. So we're having these blend of reactions, and overall we're getting better quality and better performance in each of these pods.
It makes sense. I think that the short answer that I would go with is you need to have people reviewing what the ChatGPT or whatever the AI is, what it's producing. And I have an analogy I'll give to you that I really like. I love my yard. I've got a beautiful suburban yard here in Indiana, and I do all the artistic, strategic stuff to the yard, the pruning, the shaping, the planting, all that sort of stuff. But I don't do the tactical stuff. I don't mow it. I did a lot of mowing of my lawn when I was a kid, right? I'm done with that. Someone else mows it, does the tactical stuff. I'll do the strategic stuff. ChatGPT or AI or whatever you're talking about can do the tactical stuff. And then it falls upon the human being to come in and provide the strategy around it and the vision and really make it sizzle. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly. I see Parasar as a Sanda, but I will just piggyback on that before I jump to Parasar. So, when we look at how a developer actually uses a tool, there are different components to the various tools. But, for example, I'm a developer and I start writing a line of code, and the tool says, hey, here are 3 options for how you want to complete that line. As a developer, you scan that, and then you select a line, and then you go in afterwards and you tweak it to make it meet whatever requirements that you have. That code still gets put back in the pipeline, and it still gets reviewed by a developer. So we're thinking one of the reasons why we're seeing improved quality is almost as if you have, to your point, an assistant that completes that line for you or that function for you. You end up reviewing it and tweaking it before it actually goes for a peer review, right? So it's almost as if there's an extra layer of review in there that the developer is actually able to do. And that's why we think we're getting a little bit better quality, to your point.
Yeah, I think very interesting points that you actually mentioned. As I was listening, right, I'm hearing a lot of times we are mentioning the review, right? Okay, now that we are relying on technology to create some of these things, right, that ChatGPT to create some of the code, doesn't let the review process takes a much more importance that it has done in past. So what's your thought about it, Conroy?
Yeah. So in terms of, as I mentioned, there's two main ways of working with a tool. So one is as an inline complete tool, but the other approach is similar to how you use ChatGPT, where you prompt the tool and it can write a whole function for you, or a whole module, or an entire application almost for you, right? In that mode, which is even more performant, right, in terms of velocity, in that mode, we're expecting that a couple of things will happen. So one, depending on the developer, a developer might tend to rely on the tool a little bit more because it's now written the whole function for you rather than inline complete. So we're expecting that when that code goes over to the actual peer review, we're expecting to see potentially more comments, more feedback on the peer review side, more stress on the peer review side. So while we've completed that initial deployment and testing and experimentation and proof of value, and even productizing the inline complete portion of it, the autocomplete, let's call it like an enhanced autocomplete function, and we're relatively comfortable with the results we're getting there. Right now, we're focusing a bit more on that whole chat component when you prompt the tool and it writes a whole function for you, let's say. And now we're starting to collect the data to analyze what using this thing will do from a quality perspective, how will it impact the review process, and we're coming up with different ways to test that, right? So what's the number of comments that are there? How often does it go back and forth with an individual developer, for example? So those are some of the what the quality looks like coming out of that system. So that's the actual phase that we're in right now in the actual implementation. So maybe in a month from now, we should be able to answer that question a lot better than I can right now.
Okay, so you do see that, like, a lot of load coming down the pipeline, right? If the, development and more code being churned out, right? So a lot of testing effort being kind of more added to this pipeline, right? Is that so?
Yeah, so that's another factor as well. So,
Yeah.
Sorry. So as I mentioned, we started with a development team.
Yeah.
Right. And we knew right off the bat that what would happen is that we're going to hit bottlenecks in test. And we're going to hit bottlenecks from a story creation perspective. Essentially, the developers have run out of work to do, right? And so we were very careful in how we rolled this out. We didn't roll it across the multiple pods that we had. We actually limited it to 2 pods so we can understand that. Now, in parallel to what we've learned at the dev, we're starting to work with QA to see how generative AI can accelerate the QA portion of the pipeline. And we're also working or starting to work with a product ownership side of things, the requirements generation side of things, to see how generative AI can accelerate that part of the pipeline as well. We know right now with just the 2 pods that we've had, we've been able to consume all the stretch stories that have been created. And now we're at the point where the QA guys are struggling. They're literally a bottleneck because dev has done so much work because of this tool being enabled. So to your point, there's a lot of factors to think about as you start rolling this tool into your actual production environment.
Right. I think, that put me a question. I want to ask both of you, we have been doing this catch-up game, right? We think about the dev, right? And then we kind of come down, what should we do about testing part of it, right? I wish there was Copilot thought about out of the QA as well, right? We had a QA version of the Copilot. So what would be you guys kind of I want to hear from both of you, your thought for the industry, how do we stop this catch-up game? When we are thinking about building a tool, how do we kind of think about building it together, right? What would be your message to the industry for that?
So that's a great question, right? So if I were still in QA, I would have expected that the minute that this technology was out, I would have been all over it, right? So, I had a conversation, I think it was yesterday, where we talked about, what's one of the learnings that you took away from your past experience? And I would say, during my QA career, after having quite a bit of experience in QA, going into a new company, establishing some great practices, being able to see the result of all that work, I sort of coasted for a little bit. And it took So a new perspective, a new leader that came into the organization for me to sort of wake up and say, wait a second, a few years have passed and the industry has completely turned around. So right then and there, I think what I took away was you can never rest on your laurels, and you have to always be looking at the industry to see what the latest and greatest is from a technology perspective, from a process perspective, to ensure that you're always evolving and always getting better and better. So to answer your question, Parasar, yes, that's the lens that I took into the development side, which is why we're accelerating in development. But that same lens needs to be in QA constantly, right? So the QA team should also be all over a new technology like generative AI. There's so much that we can do in QA with generative AI, and there's so much that we can do in QA with technologies as a whole to keep that testing approach as fresh and as efficient as possible. One of the reasons why I think my approach to QA has been the way it is because some of those companies that I worked in had a mandate such as we need to do each year we need to do 30% more than what we did before. So that forces us to innovate constantly, right? And I think to answer your question about how does QA stay up to date, how does QA get out of the waiting game, how does QA catch up? I think it's actually more than how does QA catch up. It's how does QA surpass, right? So QA should be operating, I think, way more efficient than development is, because QA should shift left through development and left again through requirement. And the only way that can happen is if your QA team is extremely efficient and extremely lean and extremely innovative.
I love that answer. I'm going to come at it from the lens of a consulting company, right? Where not the final consumer, but a consulting company, because as a consultant, you have to be ahead of the market, right? You have to know the new technologies that are out there, and you have to have already thought about how you're going to manage those technologies. So for artificial intelligence, Accenture got into the game. We actually made an acquisition company that we incorporated into our touchless testing platform. It does predictive analytics using artificial intelligence. We also created a concept we call Teach and Test, where it actually teaches an artificial intelligence engine how to ingest data that's non-biased, and then uses that. It's actually does testing of artificial intelligence. So but I would say that we're very much in a discovery. We, meaning the entire industry, is very much in a discovery period right now, because we're not at all sure what's going to work. Right? ChatGPT is a brand new technology. There's more that's coming alongside ChatGPT. The generative AI, there's other kinds of AI that we have to be aware of. And there's no definitive answers, right? If you went out there and asked any particular consulting company or any industry company for that matter, what are the right answers and how do you do testing and how do you use artificial intelligence to be the most effective at testing? There's no right answer. Maybe in 5 years there will be, but right now there's not. Which leads me to kind of another, hopefully I can answer your question, Parasar.
Absolutely. I love your answers, and, I keep thinking of myself as I have sit around the four corners of the table, right? Being a consultant, being a part of the, driving a QA organization, then also running a kind of company, I keep thinking, this, that should we just think about dev and QA as an engineering aspect? If you leave the hat separately and think about you are actually solving an engineering problem, right? And if you think at that way, there is always, you will be thinking about how do I develop, how do I test, right? So you think jointly on that. I think what I'm looking forward from the industry is when these big companies, right, when Microsoft or any other company is bringing up a disruptive technology, they take that engineering approach of thinking dev and QA and the things together, rather than thinking about, I'm just creating a co-pilot for the dev. So create a co-pilot for the engineering.
I think that's amazing, Parasar. I think if you're not looking at it holistically, then you'll have exactly the problems that I'm talking about right now, which is bottlenecks all over the place, right? So we talk about optimizing a part as opposed to the whole. So
what do you think is the next big disruptive technology?
In terms of disruptive technologies, right now, my view is that we haven't seen the real impact of these large language models yet, this generative AI yet, right? I think we're at the phase where, the internet started, and no one could have envisioned all the different industries and challenges that the internet has created. If you went back several, now couple decades ago now, no one could have imagined how the internet has changed things. I think we're to your point, we're just at the very beginning of generative AI right now, and the disruption that the secondary and tertiary outputs of generative AI are going to create. That disruption is going to be even bigger than what we're seeing right now, is my thinking. Now, outside of generative AI, the other thing that's sort of on the horizon, or been on the horizon for a little bit, has been quantum. Now, if when quantum becomes real and affordable, that's going to be a whole other level of disruption, given how that will be able to handle, data, a large amount of data, the speed at which the system operates. That is going to be massively disruptive on a large scale as well. And it will supercharge the whole AI process as well. So that is going to be a massive game changer, I believe, as well. And, a little bit further up probably, but that's going to be a massive game changer. There are other technologies that have been, nascent for a while. We talk about, biometrics, and we talked about, we had a conversation, Jeff, before about AR, et cetera. So these technologies are out there, but they have not yet been as, disruptive as we thought they would have been by now. There's no doubt that the potential for serious disruption with these technologies is still there, but they haven't panned out as quickly as we expected them to. But you start coupling something like biometrics and AI together, generative AI like we have it now, and the impact is, again, tremendous. And then you start using, AR to the conversation we've had before, and things like training and all that sort of stuff, where you can literally have generative AI on top of it, directing what's going on in terms of what you're seeing. For example, in gaming, that's going to be quite disruptive already. But you start looking at something like that in a training environment, if we're talking about training pilots for different scenarios, certainly AR with the support of AI on top of that is going to be impactful.
Imagine Dungeons and Dragons with an Oculus and using AI, right? That's a whole different type of gaming right there. I'm shocked that augmented reality hasn't made more of a more traction in the industry, but I'm also shocked that electronic vehicles have not gained more traction either. They're having it at the moment, and we'll see how far they go. Infrastructure is an issue, but I totally agree with your answers on that. Parasar, I'm going to ask my final question here, unless you have some additional questions you wanted to ask.
So I think very interesting, topics that we are talking about. How do you see cloud playing a role in this whole game? The stuff, right? Cloud is the backbone, but there is a lot of hesitant of going to adopting cloud in different companies and stuff. How do you see that impacting the adoption of this AI or any other technology which is dependent on cloud?
I almost feel like cloud is a, it's a done deal, right? So I mean, if people aren't looking at a cloud right now, they likely will be for most things. So that, I think, is fully in play and will continue to accelerate. Where it starts to become interesting is now when you're potentially fully dependent on cloud, and then your loads start to change, and then your pricing starts changing. And I think now is when you start getting to things like, DevSec FinOps, where you need to start managing the cost of your cloud because you move so much to the cloud, and it just begs for you to move more, and it just consumes everything you do. So I think in the cloud space, it's less a question of are we going to go to the cloud? It's more a question of how are we going to start managing the cloud costs, right? Even tests, Parasar, when we started looking at moving a lot of our tests into various different cloud systems and simulators, emulators, whatever you want to call it, we start very quickly seeing costs ramp up. Yes, we get massive coverage in a relatively short time, but now you have to start thinking about the cost. So that, I think, is going to be a key approach to cloud, how you manage the actual cost going forward.
Yeah, we could have a whole separate section on cloud because it's a massive topic.
Yeah, I think so. I think as a entrepreneur, we kind of going in the route of developing cloud. So how do we make as how companies make cloud more adaptable for the enterprises? Like any suggestions for that?
I can speak for our organization in the sense that we're fully on board with cloud. I think it's a question of making sure that your security is good and the data is being regulated and all that sort of stuff. But really, I'm not aware of any challenges right now or a lot of hesitancy to adopting cloud. You basically just I think you really just got to get on board unless there's super sensitive material that you need to not have in the cloud, and even then you have on-prem and hybrid versions of that at this point in time. So I think you have your choice of how you move to the cloud, but I can't imagine that there are many organizations that are not looking at this right now.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, well, I always like to end our podcast with a very fun, very simple question. What is your favorite technology experience in your career?
My favorite technology experience in my career. Favorite or fun?
It can be fun. Yeah.
What's that?
It can be fun, favorite, just interesting.
Or interesting. I would have said, it was that recognition. Well, generally speaking, I enjoy new technologies. Right? I enjoy seeing a new technology being identified, adopted, and implemented, and then seeing the results of that at the end of the day. There's so much that we can do, whether it's QA or whether it's development or whether it's looking at the entire pipeline, and seeing that new like right now, the whole concept of generative AI is very exciting to me. Like when we had that group of developers that we prototyped this with, we piloted this with, and we saw the results, and then we were able to go to a broader audience and communicate the results of what we're seeing, and just seeing the reaction to people on the power, the potential power of this thing was really amazing to me. So, what's my favorite thing about the technology experience or the technology space? It's seeing new technologies being adopted and actually bearing fruit at the end of the day.
I think our listeners can relate to that. Well, let me thank you, Conroy, for your time today. It was a very fun discussion with you and very enlightening as well. You know your space very, very well. Parasar, any other comments before we sign off?
No, I think it's a great discussion. Got to learn a lot of things, always from Conroy, and it's a great to be a part of this podcast. Thank you, Jeff.
We'll see you in the air.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.